Welcome everyone to our fourth and final thematic panel of our International Smart City Symposium. My name is Luciana Singolani from the Center for Digital Governance at the Hertie School, and together with my colleague here, Niklas Kossow from CityLAB Berlin, whom you already know very well, we will be moderating this panel. We did something really risky in this panel. We used the word administrative in the title, which is most definitely not one of the cool buzzwords in the narratives around smart cities. But of course we did so given the importance that administrative capacity issues have for the effective implementation, for the ultimate realization of smart city projects, or whatever label we want to replace it with, and for that matter, for any public innovation projects. As you saw yesterday, capacity issues came up immediately. They came up in our very first panel, in the very first presentation by Teresa Pardo. We saw a lot of that just recently in our data governance panel. And I think, for example, a lot of what Beth Novak presented yesterday in her keynote was about giving tips on how to improve the implementation of smart city projects, at least those related with using collective intelligence and collaboration and citizen engagement and so forth. So in this panel, we want to give us the chance to explore more in detail what are these capacities that local administrations, not only local administrations, but mostly them, would need in order to make things happen. So perhaps by gathering expertise from both academia and I should say very experienced practitioners, we can learn a bit more systematically how to build administrative capacities, how not to build administrative capacities, and perhaps more generally, which role do they play in the bigger picture around smart cities. We have 6 speakers today, although not all of them are here. We will wait a few more minutes, but otherwise we definitely can get started. We have, in principle, 6 speakers and 1 commentator. So I would now kindly ask all of you to open your cameras very quickly. And perhaps it's also a good opportunity to briefly open your mics so that we make sure you can unmute yourselves. Perhaps quickly say hi to the audience. So let me welcome Albert Meyer, Professor of Public Innovation at Utrecht University.
Hello, everybody.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. Welcome Aaron Maniam, Deputy Secretary at the Singapore Ministry of Communications and Information.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here.
Let me say how nice it is to have someone with expertise on Singapore. This is really great, a truly global event. Welcome, is Soonji here? She's still not here. But perhaps Soonji Kim, Head of Urban Policies and Reviews, will join us briefly from the OECD. Welcome Mila Gasco Hernandez, Associate Research Director at the Center for Technology in Government at the University at Albany in the US. Welcome, Mila.
Thank you. Well, very nice to see everyone, and very good friends as well in this panel.
Welcome also Kerko van Hanen, Program Director for Smart City Kalasatama, Helsinki.
Hello, nice to meet you, and thank you for the invitation to be in this panel.
A pleasure to have you here. Welcome Andrea Halmos, Policy Officer at the Technologies for Smart Communities Unit of DG Connect at the European Commission.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here.
And finally, very welcome Erkki Karo, who will be our commentator today, Associate Professor at the Ragnar Nuxe Department of Innovation and Governance at the University of Tallinn. And I'm very sorry for the poor pronunciation, probably. Welcome, Professor Karo.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. You did rather good job. So.
Thank you. So before I pass it on to Niklas for some additional information, perhaps a final note on the structuring of this panel. Soon Jin Kim is there. Welcome, Soon Jin.
Yes, hello. I don't know if you can hear me. I somehow can't see myself, so I'm trying to figure this out. Anyway, I can hear you very well.
We can hear you very well. We cannot see you.
Okay, I'll try to figure that out.
We'll try to fix that.
Okay,
thank you and welcome. So now all the speakers are here. And the way we thought about structuring these is that we will first have 3 presentations of about 7 to 8 minutes each. And then we will give the floor to Professor Caro for some comments or some reflections on the first 3 presentations, perhaps also collect a few questions from the audience before we move on to the remaining 3 presentations, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time to address general questions from the audience for any of the speakers and engage in conversations between the speakers, of course, as well. And with that, I pass it on to Niklas.
Yes, thanks so much, Luciana, for all the for welcoming us and for all the information. I will just add some technical information, so please make sure you join from a compatible browser, which would be Firefox and Chrome. Sujin, if your camera doesn't work, maybe try refreshing your browser and rejoining the session. That can often help. For everybody on the right side of the screen, you can find the session chat. So if you click the session tab and then chat, here you can ask questions throughout the workshop. You also find the polls that we have open here, which our speakers and we suggested to get some additional insights from you. And you can also see the list of attendees. So this is a moderated session. It means that only the speakers and invited guests and the moderators can share their audio and video. But as I said, we will pay attention to the chat, and we can also discuss here. If you want to see one speaking in large, you can double click on their video and you can focus them on your screen. And if you have any general questions related to the event, you can also post in the event chat. But let's keep it at that. Let's kick it off here. Luciana, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Niklas. So let me present Albert Meyer a bit more in depth. As I said, he's Professor of Public Innovation at Utrecht University, where he also chairs the Public Management Group. He has conducted and published extensive research in the areas of public innovation, smart cities, ICT, data, and social media in the public sector. I should add open government, most definitely. He is a frequent advisor to Dutch national, regional, and local governments, and he's also the editor-in-chief of the Information Polity Journal. Again, welcome, Albert. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Is it working, right?
Yes.
Okay, Luciana, thank you, and Niklas, thank you very much for inviting me to be in this session, and it's great to be here with such a wonderful set of presenters. So really good to meet all of you here. What I will be talking with you about is about what I call the open governance capacity. And the message that I want to bring across today is that we have to think in an innovative way about what government capacity is. And I will make the argument that open governance capacity is a new form of capacity that becomes increasingly important for government, and especially when we're talking about the governance of the smart city. Open governance capacity is not about open government. It's not about making data available through data portals. It's a new way of collaboration on the internet, where massive amounts of individuals are working together to produce public value. That is the key of what open governance is. I will provide you with an example a little bit later on, but first I would like to highlight how open governance is different from regular forms of administrative capacity. When we talk about administrative capacity in the public sector, we tend to focus most actually on the idea of bureaucratic government. The idea that government is a machine where there are clear responsibilities, clear tasks, clear procedures, etc. Government officials need to have the right expertise. We need to have the right forms of communication. So the machine needs to function really well. And often when we talk about capacities, it's about making this machine function. A second model that we know, and that was actually started with the new public management movement, is the idea of entrepreneurial government. And then government capacity is not so much about this machine metaphor, but it's much more about running a business. And then we're talking about things like performance measurement, incentive structures, performance contracting. So we talk about bringing all the capacities that one needs to run a business to government to ensure that government work functions as entrepreneurial government. A third form of what I would call traditional administrative capacity is the collaborative governance. It's the latest form, and the idea is that governments collaborate with other actors in society, such as businesses, NGOs, other stakeholders, as a team where they collectively tackle different types of problems. And here, when we talk about capacities, it's about the capacities to function as a team. So these three forms are well known in public administration, and they're very relevant to making governments function and to make smart cities function well, to create administrative capacity. What I would like to add to this overview is the idea of open governance. And open governance is the idea that the internet facilitates new forms of collaboration between massive amounts of individuals. This is facilitated by the internet, and the internet reduces the transaction costs of collaboration, and therefore we can collaborate in massive ways. And of course, these new forms of collaboration are quite well known in the private sector. One can think of Airbnb or Uber or other forms of collaboration. But the argument here is that this new organizational model is also very relevant when we think about the public sector. And I'll give you the example of the earthquake in the Canterbury region in New Zealand in 2011. So there was an earthquake there. There were all kinds of problems. People had to leave their houses. People didn't have access to water. People didn't have access to food. People needed medical relief. So there was a huge crisis situation. And usually what happens in a crisis situation is that the machine model moves in and we organize the procedures, policies, responsibilities to ensure that everybody gets the type of relief that he or she needs. The interesting thing about the Canterbury region is that universities and other stakeholders set up a network environment where people could indicate what they needed or what they could offer on a map of the region. So people could indicate, I can offer water, or I can offer medical relief, or people could say, water is needed here, we need medical relief, we need food. So the platform functioned as a way of coordinating the disaster relief. And in that way, hundreds of people could work together to create new forms of crisis management. And as you can see in this model, it's not so much about the machine. There was not a centralized responsibility. It was a distributed responsibility, which was enabled by this platform environment that facilitated the coordination between hundreds of individuals. So if we look at this model from a more theoretical angle, we can distinguish four key components. And the components have been presented in the literature in different books, but I think we can bring them all together in this notion of open governance. And the first component is the idea of radical openness. Again, this is not about open government in the traditional sense, where there is an open data portal and governments make their data available to citizens or stakeholders. No, it's a polycentric notion of openness. Everybody is being open about, well, in the case of the Canterbury region, what they need, what they can offer, where they are moving. So the idea of openness is not a centralized feature, but it's a distributed feature. And there is a culture of openness, and this culture of openness facilitates these forms of distributed collaboration. A second component is the radical citizen centricity. what we see in the Canterbury region is that the relations between citizens are crucial rather than the relations with government. And government is actually more on the background. It's more facilitating all these interactions, but the interactions take place through individuals. So whereas we see in the current literature, for example, the book by Basin on leading public design, that there's more a focus on what do citizens want, what can they offer, what are their perceptions. In open governance, it goes one step further because it's a form of radical citizen centricity where the networks of citizens are the key to the organizational model. The third element is what we call connected intelligence. It's about self-organization to provide instant access to experience. It's some of you may know the book by Eric Raymond, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, where he presents the way that Linux, the operational system, was developed as a very new way of organizing collaboration, because there's no central plan, there's no central owner. It's a distributed system where everybody can add components to the Linux operational system. So that happened in technological environment, but here in the case of the Canterbury region, we also see it happen in a public sector environment where we see forms of self-organization between all these citizens that result in new forms of crisis management. And the fourth and final component is a concept that we do not use much in public sector. Altruism is sometimes used as sort of a naive, ideal way that people could be altruistic. But in these network environments, we actually see many forms of altruism, where people are willing to contribute to the public good, and we've seen that in technological environments such as Linux. We've seen that in Wikipedia, where people contribute, but we can also see that here in these types of crisis management situation, where citizens are willing to contribute to the public good by bringing in their own knowledge and helping out people. So what does this mean? Does it mean we can do away with the machine and with the business model and with the team and replace it all by this model of open governance? No, that is not the message for today. My message for today is that we have to find smart ways to combine these different forms of capacity. So governments, on the one hand, need this classical bureaucratic capacity that we see in the machine, but they also need the more entrepreneurial capacity that is the key to the business model. They need the capacity to collaborate with other actors in society, but they also need the open governance capacity to collaborate on a large scale with countless individuals. And the last model is actually the newest one. It's seen as a sort of irrational, it's not practiced much, but as I've said, we've seen great examples in the private sector where these types of collaboration have been very successful. And that's why we argue that for the public sector, it's also crucial to develop this type of capacity to find very new ways to develop public value in the smart city. So the key task for government is combining these four models of administrative capacity. This presentation is based on the paper that I wrote with Miriam Lips and Kai-Ping Chen. You can find the paper here on the slide. I would be very happy to send it to everybody who's interested in the paper. I'd be very interested to hear your comments, and also I'm very interested in the other presentations. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Professor Meyer. Perfect timing, and our audience can start to post questions on the chat anytime. We will come back to those after we finish with the first round of presentations. Let me now introduce Aaron Maniam. Aaron Maniam has many hats, we could say. He's a civil servant, a poet, an educator, a diversity facilitator, and a PhD researcher at Oxford at the moment. He was the first head of the Singapore Center for Strategic Futures. Currently, he's Deputy Secretary at the Ministry of Communications and Information in Singapore, where he coordinates policy related to digitalization. Aaron, a pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Luciana, and thank you to the organizers for this very kind invitation. As you mentioned, the PhD research is an important part of the many hats that you talked about. Albert, it's a real pleasure to meet you, and after having read so much of your work, on public administration paradigms, especially. I wanted to talk today about the Singapore experience in implementing some of the ideas that we often discuss in public administration and digital government literature. And I wanted to start with the fact that in Singapore, we're an interesting experimental space because we are simultaneously a city, a state, and an island. So we operate in a very compressed space, a huge amount. And so purely as a city already, I think there are interesting dilemmas that we face. There are even more interesting dilemmas that we end up dealing with because of trying to be a smart city. Right? The idea of the smart nation is a very important aspect of our public policy guiding principles. And we kind of subdivide that into the smart economy, smart society, as well as a smart government. And today what I wanted to do was to talk about how important it is to have deeply and tightly integrated approaches to public administration, precisely because we need to meet the simultaneous challenges of being both city, state, and island at the same time. There are both risks and opportunities that come from this. I personally think the opportunities outweigh the risks, things like resource constraints and the fact that we are quite small. I think the opportunities for tight coordination and deft response and agility are also very significant. And I think these play out particularly in the smart city or smart government sort of space. And I wanted to really mention 5 aspects that I think are going to be critical for this kind of integration to occur in. The first is that we often pride ourselves on the fact that all of our work has to be whole of government. Right? When we make policy, in order to be coherent in a city, state, and island setting, any policy has to be whole of government. We can't think of it in terms of the specific turf of a single agency, but we have to be thinking about how multiple agencies come together to coordinate and deal with the invariable tensions and trade-offs that exist amongst different policy aims. And this is doubly true when we're dealing with the use of technology and digital transformation in the idea of a smart city in particular. We actually have an entire coordinating body called the Smart Nation Digital Government Office that coordinates all work done by different agencies in the digital government sphere. And this office is cited in the Prime Minister's office, so it has a huge amount of positional authority to actually coordinate and draw across multiple agencies. But what we also do is try and make sure there is that capacity at the individual agency level, because if it only works at the center, but it's not actually taking place amongst other agencies, then we find that implementation capacity starts to get eroded. So we have actually found ways to identify digital transformation officers in every single ministry and every single government agency so that they can take care of the work of their agency in terms of overall digital transformation. These people come together very regularly, to coordinate across different areas and to ensure that any inevitable tensions or trade-offs are brought to bear in the work that they do. So I think this whole of government notion is a very important foundation. But what we've also realized over time is that it's not enough. If only the government is coordinating amongst itself, but no one else is coming on board, then actually the full blossoming of a smart nation is not fully realized. So the second aspect I wanted to talk about today is what I'd like to call whole of society or whole of nation approaches to administrative capacity. We need to ensure that the administrative capacity of the government is there to facilitate and allow for capacity in other sectors, including business and the community, to also be fully realized. Now, you might call this, if you like, citizen engagement. I think there are links here to what Albert talked about, right, in terms of the connected intelligence that a truly open government has. And the way in which we try and play this out in Singapore, right, to actually implement the ideas of radical connectedness is to ensure that there is detailed community engagement on pretty much every aspect of policy. We come from the belief that government is going to be informed, will not have full information about everything, that government will have a certain amount of its own mental models and assumptions about the world that might prove to be incomplete, and we therefore need to complement that with the work of businesses and the work of community groups as well. One thing we've done in the time of COVID, for instance, is we started what we call alliances for action that bring together stakeholders from the public, private, and people sector to work on specific public policy challenges that we find pressing for ourselves as a city-state and island. And these are taking place increasingly in the digital realm, actually. A lot of groups are meeting by Zoom, the consultations are happening by Zoom, and then the ideas happen in that digital space. But they're also trying to address digital problems. One of the things I'm most encouraged by is that these groups are starting to look at problems of digital inclusion. They're trying to make sure that there is a smart, connected data infrastructure across the entire country, which the private sector is trying to build. And I find that when we have the energy of private sector and community or people sector players, that complements the scale and institutional reach that the government alone will have. And I think it creates a much more interesting vibrance and dynamism in the work that we're trying to do. So that's the second aspect of whole of society or whole of nation approaches that we find quite key. The third kind of integration that we think must happen is actually integration across time, where we're dealing not just with the present day, but thinking very actively about the future. And you mentioned, Luciana, that I was head of the Center for Strategic Futures at one point in my career. And I do think this capacity is really quite critical. We need to ensure that there is capacity both at the center of government and amongst different agencies to do active and deliberate planning for what the future might look like, prepare for different scenarios, and then make sure that across these different range of outcomes, we are able to respond to today, right? In terms of how our current policies might be incomplete, or how we might need to set up new structures to deal with these particular aspects. The future work, I think, is particularly well illustrated in some of our smart city policy aspects. Our Urban Redevelopment Authority, for instance, has a master plan that goes out about 50 years, and they are thinking quite actively about how technology can feed into not just digital experiences, but also how can we use technology to convert the living experience in an aging society, right? What do we do to make individual apartments or homes much healthier in terms of the overall tech that we use in ways that allow for the alerting of a hospital if an older person falls and doesn't move for more than an hour, right? There are interesting sensor technologies that we think can be used there that don't invade privacy, but allow for people's safety and security to actually be taken care of. So that's the aspect of futures, which I do think is a kind of integration that needs to happen as well. So we're thinking not just of integration across space, but integration across time. The last two aspects that I want to just touch on very quickly in the last couple of minutes. The first of these is the importance of design, right? So integration across not just the supply mode of what we can give as a government, but what citizens actually need. And here, actually, I think, when Albert talked about citizen-centricity, we're dealing with exactly the same thing. So I can see lots of rhymes and resonances between our two presentations already. In Singapore, what we try and do with citizen-centricity is all of our smart nation policies take place along what we call the continuum that is known as the moments of life. So basically, from the minute someone is born until they pass away, there are the key aspects of where they will interact with the digital space, and we make sure that those are provided for. So registering a birth, registering a kid for school, registering for military service, which is an important thing in Singapore, registering for university, going in for a job, being part of the government's national skilling efforts, which allow people to digitally train themselves. All that can be done in this single consolidated space because we try and map out the user journey in a very detailed way. I suspect Hertie will have thoughts on this as well, given that Estonia also looks at different parts of the citizen journey in the work that they do in the e-Estonia experience. But I do think this aspect of design and integration across the moments of a citizen's life are a really important part of how a smart city, state, and island can choose to function. And I wanted to end with just one last note. I mean, this is an aspect that I think we aren't doing very well at yet, but we're starting to think about in a much more integrated way. We tended to deal very well with the rational, efficiency-based aspects of a citizen experience. We haven't thought as much about mental health in the digital space. And I do think this is particularly critical in a smart city, right? If we want to be not just smart, but wise as a city, how do we do that? And how do we take into account the kinds of mental stresses that we're all facing, especially in a world that has been riven by the pandemic of the past year? I don't have immediate answers to this, but I do want to highlight it as a question we all have in our heads in Singapore. And we're trying to answer that because we think there are opportunities that come from the technology of a smart city, but also important alienating effects that might exist from that technology. And we want to make sure that we can use a city as a wholesome collective community rather than an alien alienating experience, which some urban experiences can sometimes become. So those are the 5 aspects I wanted to tackle, right? Whole of government, whole of society integration, futures thinking, design thinking, and then how we incorporate mental health into the overall experience of the smart city. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions later. Thanks, Luciana.
Many thanks, Aaron. We'll definitely follow up on these topics and newer topics, things like your last point on mental health that we don't often encounter in discussions like these, right? Especially, as you said, in the current context. Zujin, we saw that you struggled to connect and you managed. Congratulations. Perhaps
Thank you.
Wonderful. It's wonderful to see you. So let me present Sujin Kim. She's the head of the Urban Policies and Reviews Unit at the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities. She has 20 years, she doesn't look like, she has 20 years of experience advising cities and national governments. She led the OECD Principles on Urban Policy, and she serves in several cross-sectoral policy networks at the OECD, such as the Working Party on Urban Policy, the Roundtable of Mayors and Ministers, and the Program on Smart Cities and Inclusive Growth. So thank you again, and now if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your patience. And I was wondering if I could share my screen myself, if that's okay. Is that mine that you see?
Yeah,
yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Let me just put it on slideshow. Thank you, and greetings from Paris, where the OECD is based, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where I've been working for the past 20 years indeed, supporting cities and ministers in charge of urban policy. And among other things, I also lead a program called the OECD Program on Smart Cities and Inclusive Growth that I'll tell you briefly about in 3 points, basically, around 3 very simple questions, hopefully: where, who, and how. So where is really about in which areas, in which cities can really smart cities make a real difference, if any. The who is literally about the actors and the stakeholders that need to be involved and engaged in smart city projects to contribute to their effectiveness. And I'll finish with a question about how and the impact of smart cities on people's well-being and daily lives, and how we can know that it's making a difference. So let's start quickly with the where. It is an important question for me because, as we all saw, I think, with the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis, of course, our cities, our communities, our regions were not expecting such a huge crisis. But most importantly, what the crisis showed is really that our places, our cities, were really not equal in front of this crisis. They were not equally hit by the crisis, and they were not equally prepared to cope with such a crisis. So, for example, the first graph that you see on the left is showing you...
sorry, I think we're not seeing your presentation mode at the moment. We only see the first slide on your PowerPoint.
Okay, it's so weird because I see my map. Maybe we'll just go back to you share. Do you see it now?
No, we can't see it, but I can, if you want, you can stop the screen share, then I can share my screen and follow your lead.
Sorry, apparently the OECD has a very strong firewall, so I stopped sharing.
Which we actually do appreciate. It's good to pay attention to security. But,
so let's go back to you sharing.
Yes, there we go.
And so, yeah, so I was already gone, the where, the who, and the how, and you can go to the next one, where I was saying that our cities and our regions are really not equal in terms of their exposure to the crisis and also their capacity to rebound from it. Because if you go back just to the previous one for a second, I was saying that the graph that you'll see, the map that you'll see on the left, if it appears, yes, You can't see much, of course, now, but it's basically showing you that the share of jobs that are potentially at risk during the COVID-19 pandemic is very unequal across OECD member countries. So you see places where only, about below 15% of jobs are at risk, whereas in some others it's going beyond 35. Or so, but the capacity to rebound from the crisis is also pretty unequal. And in that, the good news is that cities are better equipped than rural areas or even intermediate cities to rebound from the COVID-19 crisis, because they have a higher share of jobs that can be worked remotely. So that was on the previous slide with the graph that was showing you that basically cities in general have a much higher share of jobs that can be worked remotely than the rural areas. What we see in the next slide now is that, of course, the cities that had smart city projects already underway might be therefore, better equipped and a bit more advanced to cope with the COVID-19 crisis. But what we also noticed is that not every kind of innovation that was implemented in those days of COVID-19 crisis, not every innovation requires, advanced data science or even a formalized innovation plan. Because what we saw is that, this pandemic is not the first one nor the last one to hit cities. And so many cities have sort of demonstrated what we could call the survival instinct in that sense that, from one day to another, they resorted to, for example, tactical urbanism, and you saw those cycling lanes, for example, popping up in your street from one day to another, and that, that was a smart move, but it didn't necessarily require data scientists or engineers or a formal smart city plan to do it. And same thing with extending the terraces of restaurants on the sidewalks of streets. That was not a data-intensive innovation, but still it did contribute to the city's capacity to cope with this pandemic. What we should, of course, keep in mind is that these easy emergency short-term solutions are not necessarily the substitutes for much longer term and more structural and more structured reforms. And so that's what we mean by the easy come, easy go. I think there should be a mix of short-term solutions and also long-term solutions. So this is really about the where the smart city tools are already in place and how they can advance, and why it makes a difference, to take those territorial differences into account. So now let's go to the second point, which was more about the who and the types of actors that can contribute to smart city projects. And here there is obviously an important role for cities, because as the name indicates, we're really talking about how to make cities smarter. But beyond the cities, there are also a number of actors that need to be engaged. The next slide will show you, of course, a little bit of the diversity that exists in terms of smart city projects, because there are many, many cities, and you could basically fill the whole world map with examples of smart city solutions that have been adopted across OECD member countries and beyond. I won't go through them, but on the next map, I also wanted to show you that the role of national governments is also extremely important in making sure that, first of all, the enabling conditions, the framework conditions were there for those cities to implement through regulatory frameworks, fiscal frameworks, or incentives to stimulate, the emergence of innovative ideas in cities. And there are, again, many countries and many national governments among OECD member countries and beyond, starting from Canada, going all the way back to Russia and Japan, for example, and Korea, where national governments are playing their role and they're also lifting their weight. So there needs to be this alignment, I think, between city capacities and national government capacities. They have a different role to play in terms of, the national government playing this enabling and facilitating and brokering role, and cities seizing this opportunity to implement locally tailored solutions. So that was on the who. Now, if we can move to the third and final point, which was really about the how can we know that these smart cities are helping really improve people's well-being on a daily basis. And so the next slide will show you that this is why our program at the OECD is devoting a lot of attention to how we can measure the outcomes of smart cities. And so because we know that there is no automatic guarantee that smart cities will automatically improve the well-being of everyone, and particularly those residents within cities that are not necessarily digitally savvy or who are privileged enough in a way to have access to the digital infrastructure and the equipment and the opportunities. So that's why, even, some very well-intentioned investments in smart city projects can actually either deepen the digital divide or also raise, risks that are pretty well known, I think, to individual data privacy. They can raise regulatory challenges in terms of who owns the data, who accesses it, and what to do with this. So this is why at the OECD we are currently developing a framework to measure and evaluate smart city performance. It's organized around 3 pillars, and I'm happy to share the paper in the chat later on. But beyond the simple point of measuring smart city performance per se, if we go to the next slide, I think it's also important to think about the capacity of cities to innovate in a broader sense. And this is in relation to a project that we are conducting at the moment in collaboration with Bloomberg Philanthropies based in the US. The report is called Innovation and Data Use in Cities, and it's going to be published in a few months, where we conducted a joint survey across 147 cities in the world, spanning basically all continents. And what we saw there was not necessarily constrained to just the smart city component or the digital innovation, let's say, but more the broader capacity of cities to innovate. And many of the cities that participated in the survey did raise some of the questions that were, I think, at the core of our session today, for example, in terms of how to combine the innovation timeframe with electoral cycles. And because, for example, this city of Curitiba in Brazil was raising the issue that political cycles, generally 4 years, are too short and also don't match necessarily the innovation cycle that you would need to implement real progress. And there's this fear of failure among city governments that sometimes can impede innovation and smart city innovation in particular. And through this survey, we saw a few examples of cities that actually embraced this, opportunities to fail because it allows cities to at least try. And sometimes, yes, they will fail, but they will also learn from their failures. And this is why we've seen some very interesting initiatives, such as in Helsingborg in Sweden, where they even instituted, the city government created this internal award called Failure of the Year, where they actually celebrate the best failure of the year, because it allowed people in the city government to learn from their failure. And that's also the same in Adelaide in Australia, and in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where basically they're trying to push the city governments to okay, you can act small. You don't have to do a multi-million-dollar innovation, but you can fail, preferably fast, so that you can learn also quickly. So I'll stop here. Thank you again so much for all your patience with this technological mishaps, which is such an irony, isn't it, when we're trying to talk about digital innovation. I'll stop here, and I'll share all the links in the chat. The last slide was actually about all the things that you can read on top of it. Thank you.
Wonderful, and thank you so much for this global comparative perspective. I think the gong went on, but it was quite soft, or I'm not sure. Okay. Well, then everything is perfect. I would like at this point to invite Hertie Caro to comment on these presentations or raise additional or complementary issues. He's associate professor, as I said, at the Ragnar Nuxe Department of Innovation and Governance at the University of Tallinn, where he is also director of the Digital Governance Lab. He has conducted extensive research on innovation capacity topics and is co-author of the upcoming book, Innovation Bureaucracies, Let's Make the State Entrepreneurial, a connection to Albert Meyer's concepts right there, together with Rainer Kattel and Wolfgang Drexler. So, Professor Caro, you have a few minutes to address comments on the previous presentations.
Okay, thank you. I hope you hear me well enough. Can you indicate how many minutes is a few minutes, so that I know more or less?
But perhaps 3 or 4?
Okay, thanks. So I think the presentations were extremely interesting, and I think there was a common thread in these presentations that I started to think about, which was related to the questions of what Albert was mentioning on openness, what Aaron was mentioning on the whole of government approach, or whole of society approach, actually, not whole of government, but whole of science society. And the last presentation then also on the COVID experiences. And this was actually, all of these led me to thinking is that we are actually kind of living in a time and context where all of these drivers might actually kind of pose a question that will all this openness and participation and collaboration eat sort of smart city as a concept even more than it does now. Because what I mean by that is that when we engage with stakeholders in improving something, right, then the stakeholders don't normally care about who is delivering a service or who is delivering a policy. They care about the result, right? And if you think about where we live today, what we care about is environment, what we care about is well-being, mental health of issues. We care about economic development and so forth. And many of these things are not actually topics for smart cities, right? But when cities try to kind of improve their services, the expectations relate to actually things that are often more about national policies by now. So in that sense, we end up, I mean, to some extent, I think my own city, Tallinn, has a paradoxical situation here, is that our city level climate goals are more ambitious than our national climate goals. If you think about that, that's kind of impossible to achieve, but the expectations of the people living in the city are actually beyond what the national consensus is. So in that sense, I'm kind of wondering is that isn't it that actually by trying to improve the living in cities, we are actually impacting national or even EU policies even more. And this is actually oftentimes driven also by kind of global trends in terms of urbanization and more people moving to cities, and cities becoming globally kind of the key change agents in terms of sustainability transitions or whatnot. So this was kind of my first question, is that, and this leads to the second question that I have related to this topic we have here, is that can you really separate in this context the questions of administrative capacity from policy capacity? In the sense of the overall legitimacy mandate of what are you pursuing. And this leads me to the third question of Singapore, that should we talk about it as a smart country and leave it out from the smart city discussions, because your uniqueness in terms of the legitimacy of the city as a nation actually gives you much more space to build policy capacity and design administrative capacity. Whereas in other places, you need to probably have much more kind of multi-level governance perspective, and you need to negotiate with the national government in terms of what do you do, and what you cannot do. And in that sense, I think this is a kind of interesting and crucial topic when we think about the future of where the cities go. But of course, the latter part also relates to what Albert was proposing as 4 models. I mean, this leads straight away to the questions of what to use when, in what conditions, right? And for what type of developments that we might gain new insights from having kind of openness towards citizens, towards users. But this leads us to actually push further policy changes on national level. And for that, we might need to have different kinds of capacities there and so on. So I think this was kind of what I was kind of thinking during the first 2 presentations. And then I think the third presentation fits very much into this context, but it's not so much about maybe sustainability or normal things, what we expect from the cities in normal times. But in this COVID context, I think the situation is more or less the same. We expect cities to solve pandemics, right? And cities try to solve pandemics, but we are living almost like in an experiment. We are all stuck in a city, and we cannot move away when we don't like the city at the moment because it's very difficult. So I think the cities have huge accountability in terms of what kind of services, what kind of solutions we design. And because we live basically 2 years in the same place, more or less, very little travel, so we learn new behaviors. And these will become kind of common norms or common expectations that, you know, some people probably haven't visited their second house for a year or a year and a half. Then restrictions are off, they go there, and you discover that the city has actually redesigned itself totally differently than I was expecting. And I have kind of gotten new norms and activities and so on. So I think this is kind of things I was wondering about it. And it overall comes together is this, you know, the borders of where are the borders of the city in nowadays, and where are the borders of the administrative and policy capacity, and do we really have them, or they have become so much blurred that we need to kind of have a very much open mind when we think about the challenges ahead, not just, you know, how to make cities better, but how to make life better and so on. This was just general.
Thank you. And let's see who would like to briefly address any of these comments. You can simply raise your hands. Go ahead, Aaron.
Thank you so much, Luciana. Hertie, thank you. I mentioned in the chat, shall I leave? But I won't. I do think we have an important set of roles. I agree with you, actually. I think there are many opportunities that come to a place like Singapore because we are both country as well as city. I'll just say that there are trade-offs. There are other difficulties as well, because many cities have the pressure release valves of people moving out if they don't want to deal with, you know, the stresses of urban life, or if they don't want to deal with some of the challenges that come from the urban space. It might be a values-related challenge. It might be issues related to density of living. Singapore doesn't have that. We can't tell people, please move to another part of the city if you happen to believe X politically and move to another part if you believe in Y. Unlike larger countries which have the ability to have, cities be much more, in some ways, more liberal versus more conservative. So I'll just say that I think there are always going to be trade-offs and pluses and minuses. And the real important thing is to figure out, in the space that we're in, how do we kind of maximize the opportunities that are there while managing the invariable and inexorable challenges. Thanks.
Albert?
Yeah, Hertie, thank you very much for your comments, and also thanks to Aaron and Sujin for the interesting presentations. I would like to pick out one thing, and that's the question: where are the borders of the city, or the way I interpret it? What does government need to do, and what can society do? And I think that's a very, very important question, because on the one hand, it's a question of capacity. For example, if I look at my own city, when it comes to maintaining green facilities in public spaces, then in certain parts of the city, people are really engaged, they're well connected, they have the skills to organize themselves, and they're able to maintain green facilities by themselves, and it can only be facilitated by local government. Whereas other parts of the cities, the people have fewer skills. Their neighborhoods are much more fragmented. They're less organized, and therefore local governments really need to maintain these facilities. So on the one hand, it's local. You could see government sort of as a capacity that needs to jump in when society cannot tackle the problems themselves. So that could be one way to approach it. The second way to approach it could be if you look at the legitimacy of things, and there may be a risk if government leaves things to society to self-organize itself, that the powerful groups of society will be very able to organize themselves, whereas the less able groups or the less educated, less organized groups will be left out. So then it's not only a question of capacity of society to organize itself, but also the responsibility of government to ensure that everybody's included in the way the smart city is being created. And a third way to look at it, and that's made it triggered by one of the comments Aaron made in the chat, is the capacity to create more capacity. And I think that's a very, very interesting one. And that's actually about empowering citizens. And what we see in the Netherlands, and I'm sure in other countries around the world also, is there's much more emphasis on empowering citizens to be able to organize themselves, to have the digital skills to organize themselves. So in that sense, so that they can self-organize. And this may also be targeted at specific neighborhoods. Some richer, affluent neighborhoods may already be able to organize themselves very well. Whereas you can imagine that government may need to make an effort, especially at sort of neighborhoods where people live with a lower level of education and fewer skills, that more of an effort needs to be made there to get those people included in society. So overall, this capacity is mainly about sort of the interplay between government and society, both from the perspective of effectiveness, getting things done, but also from the perspective of legitimacy, including everybody and doing this in a democratic and equitable way.
Thank you. Sojin.
Yeah, just one final point, because I know we have 3 more speakers to go through. Just something that Hertie mentioned about, people leaving the city or thinking about the city. I think cities really have this incredibly resilient capacity to solve problems when a huge problem is thrown at them. I mentioned at some point that COVID-19 is not the first pandemic that happened to cities. We did have, the plague, cholera, Spanish flu, and each of these pandemics in cities has been an opportunity to reinvent cities. And the city of Paris, where I live, for example, the cholera pandemic was the sort of trigger and the magnifying glass of all the problems that needed to be solved. And this is how we completely reshaped the architecture of the city. So I think, a really, truly smart city is a city that has the capacity to look at these problems and find in itself, the resources, the collective capacity to rebound from it and reinvent itself. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like now to pass it on to Niklas.
Yes, thank you so much. So a lot of what you already said resonated with me in many ways, especially the culture to allow for failure in government, which you already discussed in the chat, which I think is so important, but is really hard to actually create in different administrations and also different levels of government, which in Berlin, actually, Berlin is a city and has 12 local administrations making it up, but it's also a federal state within Germany, and that can also create challenges to coordinate between these different levels of government within a city. But without further ado, I want to go to our 3 further speakers. We're starting with Mila Gasco Hernandez. She is an associate research director at the Center for Technology in Government, as well as a research associate professor at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs Policy, both at the University at Albany and the state of New York. Her research areas are related to the adoption and use of information and technology in government, and amongst other things, she focuses on open government, public innovations, smart cities, and AI in government. Mila, we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Niklas. Thank you, Luciana, as well. And of course, thank you to Hertie School and the CityLAB Berlin for extending the invitation to me. My brief presentation is going to resonate with what has already said. It is based on a study I conducted a few years ago, actually back in 2015, 2016, with some colleagues from the Bocconi University in Italy. And we studied the influence of organizational capacity, administrative capacity, managerial capacity, you name it, in the development of smart cities and implementation of smart city projects. And we conducted this study in Barcelona, Milano, and Munich. And as I was saying, I thought that the learnings, although are 5-6 years ago, could be useful in the presentation today. But after hearing the presenters before, I really think it was a good idea to bring some of these findings today. What we did in this study was to start reviewing a few definitions about organizational capacity in the public sector. And we found out that this is a multidimensional concept that usually, generally speaking, includes 4 broad categories. Infrastructure on the first hand, which has to do mainly with resources availability, financial, staff, technology, etc. Management, which has to do with the effective management of these resources. Knowledge and learning, which has to do with the ability to do things differently and to learn from these new initiatives. And finally, collaboration. And what we did was to try to apply all these concepts, or better said, all these categories to what was happening in these 3 cities. We found that the 4 components of organizational capacity had an impact in how the smart city strategy was implemented and how smart city projects and initiatives were implemented in the 3 cities, and therefore in becoming, you know, a smarter city in the 3 cases. First of all, the 3 cities had the required infrastructure, so to say. They had several resources. Mainly, they had the technological and the financial resources to invest in smart city initiatives, and they had a long history of investment in technology in general. The 3 cities, and particularly Barcelona, had been pioneers in digital government, in electronic government back in the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. And that investment of technology and of financial resources in technology had dragged over time, and therefore also presented an opportunity when it came to smart cities. Of course, they also had very skilled personnel that had worked in these previous years of digital and electronic government and smart cities for a long time, and they had both the skills and the knowledge capacity in digital transformation to implement smart cities projects. Second, we also found that these resources were effectively managed by the 3 cities, and there were 2 indicators, if you wish, of this effective management. One of them was related to the existence of an explicit strategy, sound, comprehensive strategy, which, by the way, was different in each city, but it still existed in the 3 cities. And the second one was a clear organizational structure. This resonated very much with what Aaron was saying. The 3 cities had a dedicated unit in charge of implementation of smart cities projects. And what's more, the city city government unit was also in charge of coordinating the different city government departments involved in smart city development. So it acted, as Aaron was saying, as the integrator of everything that was being done in the city government around smart cities. What lies beyond this effective clear organizational structure on one hand, and the development of this smart city strategy was, of course, leadership. And we found 2 levels of leadership: political leadership on one hand, and managerial, administrative leadership on the other. And these 2 types of leaderships were not always present in the 3 cities. In the case of Barcelona, we found the 2 of them. In the case of Milan, it evolved from a more managerial leadership to a political leadership over time. In the case of Munich, it was more about managerial leadership. But in any case, in the three cities, there was some type of leadership that committed resources for the strategy and that committed resources for the structure, and that therefore supported the implementation of the smart city initiatives. Interestingly enough, when it comes to the learning and knowledge component, in the end, what we assessed here was that innovation culture or culture towards innovation that Sue Kin was referring to, and that has sparked some conversation in the discussion. And we did find that these were governments that were not fearful of failing in the implementation of these smart city projects. But interestingly enough, there was failure, and that influenced how the cities moved forward. They decided to be more cautious. So our conclusion in this respect is that that culture of innovation, being innovative, pushed the cities to be more bold in implementing smart city projects. But once they failed, and of course there were failures, what was more important was the ability to manage blame when those innovations fail. So in a way, although in the beginning that was an enabler, that culture was an enabler of innovation, once the innovation failed, that was also something that limited, and it was more important managing who to blame because of the failure than the innovation itself. So I think that's an interesting addition to what has been discussed that I think must also be taken into account. Finally, I was saying the cities had the infrastructure, so the cities had the resources, but of course, the smart city projects are not cheap, and the required investment was high in the three cities because of the ambitious, I would say, a strategy. It included several programs, it included several projects, therefore many resources were needed to implement these smart city projects and initiatives. And this actually explains the involvement of other organizations in the implementation. And again, this resonates with what Aaron and Albert were saying about collaboration. In these three cities, what we observed is that collaboration mainly takes place at the inter-organizational level. It had to collaboration had to do between the city and the regional governments clearly, and more than with the national governments, as was also said before, it had to do with the European Union. So the funding that the European Union provided city governments was very important for the implementation of these smart city projects in the cities. And therefore, the relationship between the cities and the European Union itself became more important than the relationship between the city government and the national governments in these countries. And also, as has already been said, the collaboration between these public organizations, the city governments, and the private companies, the private organizations was very important. It mainly happened through the establishment of public-private partnerships that, generally speaking, went beyond the traditional public-private partnerships, which were more based on funding or delivery of services. In the case of PPPs within these smart cities, the role of private companies were beyond, and private companies were participating also in the design and the planning of the smart city projects they were going to participate in. So those PPPs went a little farther of traditional PPPs. Interestingly enough, in the case of Munich and Milan, there was collaboration with citizens, and there were initiatives aimed at engaging the citizens. But again, in order to add something different to what has already been said, it was not the case of Barcelona. Barcelona had a very much I don't want to say isolated approach. It did everything for the citizens, but citizen collaboration, citizen engagement in the planning, design, implementation of those initiatives was really, really scarce. Yet Barcelona had a lot of success in implementing its smart cities, city initiatives and projects, and for many years has been ranked very high in the rankings about the smart cities. So I think that's also an interesting conversation that we can have, although we recognize, we acknowledge the importance of engaging citizens in a smart city initiatives implementation. It is also true that some cities seem to be doing well, seem to be successful, even though in that implementation process, citizens have not been engaged. Of course, that doesn't mean that they are aware of what's happening, that it is communicated, etc. It is more than they are not engaged in the implementation of the smart city projects. Very, very briefly, these were the 4 components of organizational capacity that we analyzed, and that therefore seem to indicate that organizational capacity does matter in the implementation of smart city projects. What we also found, and this would be my last observation today, is that even though we found that the 4 components had a say in the implementation of smart city projects, it is also true that there is no single way to implementation. So the 4 components matter, but different arrangements around these components happened in the different cities. And therefore, we concluded our study saying that in the end, context matter, not only in the design of a smart city initiatives, which of course need to address the needs of the citizens, but also in the implementation of the smart city projects that are included in those smart city strategies. And I would leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mila. A very interesting presentation. I'm very interested in how you describe the role of strategy and how it can lead to implementation and guide implementation. That's something we deal with very much in Berlin now, and questions that we're asking ourselves. Without further ado, I would go further to Kerko Van Hanen. Thanks for being here. Kerko is a program director at the Forum Virium in Helsinki and responsible for the Smart City Kalasatama Helsinki. Kerko's special competence is in smart mobility and digital service design. He has a strong interest also in smart energy solutions and generally in any innovation that makes urban life easier. Thank you for making our lives easier. And also causes less negative impacts on nature, which I think is a very important aspect. Kerko, you want to share your screen, or should I do it for you? You're still muted. You think you double click because you were unmuted for a second. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, now it works. Sorry, I was already starting to share my screen. So yes, I'd like to do it by myself. Thank you, Niklas. And hello, my name is Kerkko Van Hanen, yes, and greetings from Helsinki, Finland. Just a second. This is what I am sharing, and I suppose you will see my screen right now.
Yes, it works.
Good. Okay. So it's really actually great to be in this this session, because now I will give you a bit more, probably a bit more practical approach. I've been a program director for a project called Smart Kalasatama, and the headline here I have added is Co-creating a Smarter City. Kalasatama, it's one of former harbors, cargo harbors in the city of Helsinki, that is now transformed into housing, because the cargo harbor that used to have plenty of different functions at the very nearby of the city center has now been moved to the east of the city. So Kalasatama is a true city district, quite close to the center of Helsinki. And it was 2014 when 2030 when the City Council of Helsinki decided that we need to have a district that would serve as a true urban lab, that would serve the kind of projects that would support smart city development, and Kalasatama became to be the district. And ever since, we have had a program called Smart Kalasatama. First, it was it had different funding instrument, but the last 3 years, the Innovation Fund of the City of Helsinki has funded the project. It's an umbrella project that has allowed us to seek for different new projects that would go under umbrella of smart city development. And I would say that around 2/3 of income we have gotten have become actually from different EU funding instruments. So it has been also serving as part of the international community. It's a smart city innovation district, as we call it. We have focused on almost all kinds of aspects of urban life, such as smart energy, smart mobility, smart everyday services, robotics, and actually very important one is the digital twin of the city. So how do we kind of tell the story? We need to have a vision, and in Kalasatama it has been 1 more hour a day. That means that whatever is developed there, it should lead towards better everyday living that would actually give us more time. We would gain kind of an extra hour for the day that would not be for working. It would be probably more for leisure or for your family time. So that's the vision, and it's a soft vision but important one. The other goal is actually to support the city of Helsinki to reach carbon neutrality by 2035. And how is that done? It's done in public-private people partnership. So we need actually the city sector, the public sector that gives actually the framework, the true facilities such as the district of Kalasatama to serve as an innovation district and a platform where to build open innovations and ecosystems. We need corporations, we need smaller startup level companies, and we also co-create a lot with the academia, the universities of Helsinki and the Aalto University, the technical university. So all together, but the people, the residents in the center. In the previous presentations, we heard that it's important to make the failures fast and learn from the failures. And that's the idea also in our agile piloting programs. We have run tens of agile piloting rounds where we have had different themes, and all those thematic pilots, they have lasted like 6 months or something. And very often we have set a kind of common topic, and under that we have had then procurement processes where we have looked for good ideas how to solve the problems, how to develop the preliminary idea further. And that's a way how we have offered through market references for smaller companies. We have co-created true value for all stakeholders by working together. We have engaged the citizens in the district to become familiar with smart city development by being test users in the agile programs and projects. And of course, that creates new future use cases, probably after a failure, or that we find out good results that probably are not livable yet in a larger economical scale, but still they create new paths for the future. So this has not been top down, it has very much been bottom up, and that's how we believe is the right way here to do, when we also need to engage the people who are the ones who benefit from everything of this, but also who actually know what the true requirements for better urban life are. The city owns 2/3 of the land in Helsinki, and that has allowed in Kalasatama to invest on certain smarter solutions, such as the automated waste collection system that is under the ground in the whole district, and all waste goes in the vacuum pipelines. It encourages people to recycle and separate all different waste types. And on the other hand, that's one of the sources where we get data. We get data how often and what type of waste people in Kalasatama produce. We follow also the energy consumption in the buildings. Those are actually the requirements for all new buildings set by the city of Helsinki, because the city owns the land and can set certain very strict requirements. And that's also part of the data. So the more we create data, the more we actually are able to create also and produce open data. And on open data, you may build new services that serve us better. That also leads us towards the more accurate digital twin, which is not only a 3D model of the city, but a dynamic system where you can simulate how a city works right now and what will it look like in some years from now. So we believe that data is knowledge, and the definition here for a smart city is that it's a city full of people, ordinary people, making smart decisions in their everyday life. So I would call this kind of a city also a wise city. What we have done, we try to put in the between of the covers, and we publish everything openly. So feel free to visit Forum Virium's website, forumvirium.fi, and take a look at, for example, the cookbook, Recipes for Agile Pilots, what we have published. Thank you very much for your attention, and really interesting to continue the discussion.
Thank you very much for these very hands-on examples, and it sounds fascinating what you're doing back in Helsinki. I will now lead over to Andrea Halmos, who's our last presenter. Andrea Halmos is a policy officer at the European Commission, and she's working at the Technologies for Smart Communities unit at the DG Connect. She focuses on helping cities and communities to better harness data and artificial intelligence in order to meet their environmental and climate objectives, and also to provide high-quality services to citizens, businesses, and make better informed decisions. So, Andrea, I'm sure you have a lot of insights from different parts of the European Union, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for also the invitation and for this very interesting insights that we've heard from previous speakers. I will build a little bit on what Kerko just presented in terms of the digital twins, but I will hopefully also present things that are perhaps to cities that may be starting from a less sophisticated base, because some of you were wondering in the chat whether smart city is only for the most advanced. I think any city can start at any level, and what we're trying to do at the European Commission, and if I may just share a few slides with you, is to address any kind of city in Europe, because of course we have a huge variety of different types of cities at a different level of maturity in terms of digital. What I would like to start with is really the context in terms of a European setting or international setting that is impacting our European cities, is kind of a paradigm shift that we're seeing, whereby a lot of the different strategies coming out in the context of e-government, for example, through the Berlin Declaration on Digital Society and Value-Based Digital Government, or the most recent, I think like 2 weeks ago, Digital Compass, but also if you look at the UN Habitat People-Centered Smart Cities, all starting to converge around something similar, around a cohesive Europe that leaves nobody behind in this digital transformation, whereby technologies are really there for a means, that strive for sustainability, like one of you also mentioned, that this is really one of the key aspects. I also put here, of course, the EU New Leipzig Charter, which is a guiding force for European cities and at least the city and urban and regional development in the EU context, and something called Living in EU Declaration. And I think I've asked the organizers to do a little poll. Perhaps I can have a look at your responses to that. No, maybe
yes,
not.
No,
Yes?
you can if you go into the tab that's called polls or Umfragen in German, you scroll down to the last poll. You can see the results which are currently in. So actually 21 people now voted in the poll. 2 people only said they know the Living in EU community and movement, and 19 said no. So
that's good. There is a point for me to talk about it.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
And I will interrupt you shortly because in your presentation, we actually didn't see you present. So I will try to share my screen and follow you.
Let's do it that way then.
Yes.
I did see it. So
yeah, I thought so. So just give me 1 second.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thank you, Nicholas. So indeed, I was wondering about anyone knowing this Living in EU declaration and movement. But if you don't, I will ask you to please move to the third slide then. Indeed. So this is a declaration that was made by actually bottom up, coming together from city organizations. One of you was wondering about what kind of networks and city organizations are there that make the link between the Commission or EU level and cities. So this is one of those, for example, led by Eurocities, which is there for larger cities, or the Open and Agile Smart Cities and Communities organization, which is helping, for example, through open standards, the digital transformation of cities. It's led by the for example, Dutch Association of Municipalities and European Network of Living Labs, and supported by the Commission and the Committee of the Regions. It was brought together into these people were brought together in and drafted a declaration, which is still open for signature. So we already have over 85 signatures from cities, but also other levels of government, because the declaration believes in multi-level governance. And it includes a number of principles, as I said, very much echoing those that we see around us, which is about citizen-led and demand-led digital transformation, whereby the city is in the driving seat, and where technologies are considered just as an enabler rather than an end. And so it also includes a number of commitments, and these cities or signatories, as well as some supporting organizations that can be research and technology organizations and even companies who have also subscribed to the same principles and values, come together in order to be able to scale up European or smart city solutions, because that's what has been recognized. There's many good ideas, many good little projects around, but it's very hard to scale them up and really achieve good impact, either within a bigger city context or across Europe. So what has been recognized throughout a number of years in EU smart city projects is that it's often the main barrier is that cities get themselves logged into certain technological solutions. So this declaration is actually proposing a way for the digital transformation of cities and communities by focusing or by implementing open standard-based interoperable platforms and solutions that allow, especially in the European context, this is really important to ensure that the city can ensure that citizens' digital rights are respected. So if you see that, sorry, just in these different commitments, these cities, we work with them together. We talk on a regular basis every 2-3 months, and there's a number of commitments, and we're working, for example, on their capacity building. So if you show this next slide, indeed, in order to enable them to benefit from these kind of platforms, which is the basis. So if you wish, we talk to cities who don't have anything yet. So there we're trying to help them develop their strategies. We talk to cities who then perhaps are already there, but then they need to have some kind of a smart city platform or a number of platforms that would essentially collaborate and interoperate with one another. And then we're trying to help them better use data. And it's not just opening up data that is public data and perhaps somebody will come and create an innovative solution on top of that, but it's also looking into how to best share data in a maybe more secure environment under certain conditions, but how can cities actually tap into data that may be held by the private sector, but it would be extremely important for cities to use that for their policy making. So we call that a data space. And like our colleague from Forum Virium mentioned, how do we help cities to actually create their local digital twins? How do we arrive to a situation where the city can actually bring together all kinds of data from the different domains like mobility, energy, perhaps air pollution, and look at different scenarios and make more evidence-based decisions, but also predict certain solutions. And then we have all kinds of possibilities to test, for example, through testing and experimentation facilities, or indeed really in sandboxing environments, or really test concrete solutions through so-called digital innovation hubs or living labs. So if you show me the next slide, I here try to be quite concrete about what are the kind of capacity building measures we, at least from an EU level, can offer. And the reason being is that we have some kind of a convening power and a possibility to help exchange good practices. So we indeed help cities to develop their digital strategies. Some of you may be familiar with something called the Intelligent Cities Challenge. It's in another department of the Commission, but doesn't matter. We work with them very closely. It's in DG Grow. But we also bring the cities together in this community of the Living in EU movement. We organize a lot of workshops and good practice exchange on, for example, local digital twins. There was one yesterday. We had a few in the past couple of months, and more are coming. So if you're interested, please do get in touch. And we try to find other European projects that are already working in this context. I put here the name of Duet, which is a very promising European project that actually works with the digital twins in 3 different European cities. We're also working with the cities, and again, through workshops and other means, to actually get better understanding how to share data in this environment, in this secure environment, but also we're promoting, and through this Living in EU movement, open standards for data models, for platforms, for fair AI, and so on. Another set of capacity building measures, Nicholas, if you show me the next slide, is about how to reuse existing tools that have been created through, for example, European projects, through the work of essentially member states in agreement and an interoperable manner for addressing different points in the data value chain, how to source data, how to collect and share, organize data, better understand, for example, understand the context of data, how to better manage big data, and so on. For many of these points in the data value chain, there is already an existing reusable tool. And then if you've jumped to the next slide, I have a little lag. Yeah, we're working also with cities to understand what interoperability means for them. So yes, you could be thinking of very technical terms, but in terms of capacity building, it's also important that in context of interoperability, you also have a notion of organizational interoperability, of semantics. So what does this or the other field mean in terms of legal interoperability, but also in the smart city context, we're recognizing that there is a need for a cultural interoperability. So we have an ongoing project. We're trying to create a European interoperability framework for smart cities and communities. And at the same time, a lot of these findings from the interoperability domain have been turned into online learning tools. So there is something called the European Interoperability Academy that you're more than welcome to check out. And of course, when this work on the smart cities interoperability framework is ready, we'll also turn this into MOOC or some kind of an online training asset. And finally, we recognize that there's a huge demand from cities to better understand how to procure innovative solutions, especially when we come to the context of AI. I think Forum William will be familiar with the AI for Cities project, but there's a number of good examples on how to, for example, procure innovative solutions through, for example, pre-commercial procurement or innovative procurement, but also how to use procurement rules to actually enable for a more agile way of procuring a solution where you don't necessarily know what the final solution will be. So there's a number of projects out there. There's a number of initiatives out there. So if you're interested, I'm more than happy to guide you to the right information. We're also working on how to procure, for example, ethical AI by cities. So there's work going on that angle as well. So if I just may leave you with a final note, is that yes, there are opportunities in particular through this Living in EU community, but of course, feel free to contact me also in the context of Berlin or other cities when you're trying to figure out what to do next. Happy to put you in touch or in context with current ongoing activities or other cities that can share best practices with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We have about a little bit less than 10 minutes left for discussion, not a lot of time. Thank you all so much for all these inputs. Erki, do you want to comment first on the last 3 presentations? And for the other participants, please feel free to share your questions in the chat.
Yeah, sure. I think I will then leave also time for others to ask questions and make maybe one kind of a capacity-related comment for all in the context of all 3 projects. And this is namely is that, or 3 presentations, is that you all mentioned quite a lot the importance of EU projects or some kind of project funding, project initiatives. And I think one of the crucial issues here, leaving aside the question of how do you effectively implement whatever was the project or the experiment or the pilot, is actually the capacity to routinize the innovation or institutionalize the innovation and the lessons learned from that. In the sense that how do you exit basically from EU funding would be the question here. How do you exit from external funds in a way that actually the experiment, the pilot, the new solution will be picked up and most likely funded by traditional city budget kind of budget lines. I think this is one of the crucial challenges in many cities and many initiatives, is that if you have a supply in the sense of having piloting funds and projects and so forth, then it's easy to pick them up and leave them aside somewhere, sort of create a separate unit or hire new people. And then later, when the funding runs out, you haven't actually institutionalized this kind of lessons and activities that one needs to do to make this service or this idea sustainable. So I was more wondering, maybe you have insights from your own experiences, or maybe even, I don't know, Aaron or somebody can kind of give on comments on this as well. Is that what do you think is crucial? Because this is one of the most interesting questions for me, at least. Thanks.
I see Albert wants to respond to that. If you otherwise, who else wants to respond, please just raise your hand. And Albert, please.
Well, I actually have a follow-up question, if that's okay also. And it's a question mainly to Andrea and Kerko, but maybe also to Mila on the base of her experience. We have not really discussed the issue yet of international security, right? The whole discussion about Huawei as possibly being a way in which our data could be tapped off by international powers. So I really wonder how that is taken into account, because now it's sort of this safe, happy world where we use smart technology to make our lives better, but it can also be framed very differently as a very threatening environment where foreign powers invade into our personal lives and invade our privacy, etc. So yeah, I really wonder how do you in Helsinki or European Union or Milan and Barcelona, how's that issue being tackled?
Yes, Andrea, please.
So Erki, just to respond to you, indeed, this is really one of the biggest I mean, scaling up, scaling out is one of the biggest difficulties we see cities facing when they come out of European projects. And that is why this Living in EU community has come together, really from actually past European project partners that were trying to see how to maintain, sustain, and then eventually scale up and scale out solutions they have developed. And there was a very interesting study. I will try to find it and send it in the chat in a minute, from the Erasmus data analytics, the Erasmus analytics, that tried to understand what was the biggest barrier in terms of smart city projects maintenance and scaling up. And they have come to this conclusion that it's the platforms, because once you start using data for a certain solution and you have decided to work with a certain technology-based platform, it will be very difficult to move to another unless, and that's also the answer to Albert, unless you are working with something that is interoperable and based on open standards that doesn't lock you into a certain solution. So we're not necessarily saying, well, you should go with this or the other, or you should just go with European suppliers. What we have heard from cities, however, is that they don't really necessarily understand. And if you have a supplier that comes in with an amazing full-on complete solution, it's easy to say yes, because at the end of the day, you want a very user-friendly solution. So what we're trying to do through this capacity building as well is to understand what should be the main elements and conditions in procuring the solutions, and these should be linked to open standard-based interoperable solutions that will not lock you into a certain vendor, and that you can build upon, that you can perhaps change, that you work with modular solutions, and so on. So yeah, the idea is to actually, if you believe in this, you're probably subscribe to these principles that are in this declaration. I will share again here in the chat.
Thank you. Keko.
Yes, it's thank you. It's really easy to agree with Aaron and Andrea, first of all, about this interoperability. And well, my background is actually in the public transport side, and we have worked a lot actually with Singapore there as well, with ticketing systems and how to create openness there. And Helsinki has tried to be very open with the data, and not only data, but also with certain important created source codes. So that to avoid certain vendor locks, we believe it's important to co-create together and find the solutions that way. About Albert's question about security, so I'm not sure, did I understand your question right? Did you talk about global security or data security?
Global security.
Global security, yes. So an honest answer from Helsinki's point of view is that we luckily live in a very safe city so far. So those
how
questions,
do you know?
exactly how I know is just that not too bad things has happened during the years. However, you never know, of course. Yeah. But still, probably it's kind of blue eyes approach. But how we see what a smart city is, we still say that it's not a city full of surveillance technology, but instead it's a kind of warm and soft approach to people, to support them to find kind of higher quality in their everyday life, and that actually makes the security situation itself also better when you do not have too big differences between the different society groups, I would say. So we have so far succeeded so that we do not have too big differences between the districts of Helsinki. It's safe to go everywhere. And part of that is the politics of building and detailed planning. We do not allow to create districts that are only for example, subsidized rental housing. We mix everything. But that's part of politics, not probably part of the smart city approach. But I have to set one question, and that is now when we live in this pandemic and we go to the remote work, you said that Paris has transformed in the previous kind of pandemics or catastrophes. But how should we and our cities transform now when people stay way more at home? When 2 rooms was enough a year ago, should we now have 3 rooms because you don't go to the workplace anymore? What's the standard of a small, convenient apartment from now on when we work more remotely? That's a really difficult question, I would say.
It is indeed, and it's a question that we will have to leave unanswered at this time because our session has come to an end. But Kerko, I think that's a session we will all take with us, and please join us in the closing session. Luciana, I will give over to you for the last words.
We have to literally leave the room. Otherwise, I think it will close itself, and that will be very impolite. But thank you, everyone, again for being here and for giving us a lot of food for thought. Berlin has a lot to think about now. And we're sorry to those who couldn't vote. I also had technical problems with the polls. Sorry about that. If this event has been very overwhelming and full of ideas, the next panel, the next closing session is meant to land the key takeaways from all the workshops. Thank you.
Thank you all. And Albert, we will see you there in the closing session.
Right.